What's up, everyone? Tonight I want you to imagine stepping into a London coffeehouse in 1888, where gentlemen in top hats are discussing the morning's most shocking news over their perfectly civilized breakfast. Not the stock market crash or political upheaval, but whether the latest gruesome discovery in Whitechapel might finally give them something genuinely interesting to talk about at dinner parties. So before you get comfortable, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little community of night owls and insomniacs from around the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let's begin our journey tonight. You find yourself standing on a cobblestone street in Whitechapel, London, on a particularly unremarkable Tuesday morning in October 1888. The fog hangs low and heavy, creating that peculiar Victorian atmosphere where everything beyond 10 feet becomes a watercolor suggestion of reality. Gas lamps flicker weakly against the gray dawn, casting circles of amber light that seem to make the shadows deeper rather than chase them away. The air carries that distinctive London cocktail of coal smoke, horse manure, and something indefinably damp that clings to wool coats and never quite leaves them. You notice how ordinary everything appears, despite the extraordinary circumstances that have gripped this neighborhood for months. Mrs. Henderson is hanging her washing on the line behind her tenement, just as she has every Tuesday for the past 15 years. The baker's boy whistles as he makes his rounds, balancing a tray of fresh loaves on his shoulder, with the casual expertise of someone who could navigate these narrow streets blindfolded. A constable walks his beat, his heavy boots creating a steady rhythm on the stones. But you observe that his usual leisurely pace has acquired a certain purposeful urgency that wasn't there a year ago. The famous Jack the Ripper murders have been terrorizing this area since August, yet life continues with that particularly British determination to carry on regardless of unpleasantness. You watch as shopkeepers unlock their doors and begin their daily routines, sweeping their front steps with the same methodical care they've always shown. It's remarkable how people adapt to living with fear. They simply incorporate it into their daily schedules, like checking the weather or winding the clock. Historians still debate whether the Ripper was a local man who knew these streets intimately, or an outsider who studied them carefully before striking. You can see why this question fascinates scholars, as you navigate the maze of alleys and courts that branch off from the main thoroughfares, like the fingers of a gnarled hand. Someone unfamiliar with Whitechapel could easily become lost in these passages, yet the killer moved through them with apparent confidence, disappearing into the urban labyrinth as efficiently as morning mist. The victims were all women who worked the streets, a fact that Victorian newspapers reported with the particular combination of moral outrage and salacious detail that characterized the era's journalism. You notice how the press coverage has transformed the neighborhood into something resembling a tourist attraction. Well-dressed visitors from more fashionable districts occasionally appear, peering around nervously as if expecting to witness something dramatic. The locals regard these sightseers with the weary patience of people whose tragedy has become someone else's entertainment. What strikes you most is how the investigation itself has become a kind of performance. Police constables patrol in pairs now, their presence both reassuring and ominous. They nod politely to residents, but their eyes constantly scan doorways and shadows. The famous bloodhounds brought in to aid the search proved about as useful as a chocolate teapot, though they did provide the neighborhood children with considerable amusement as they watched the frustrated animals chase their own tails rather than following any meaningful scent trail. You overhear conversations in the local public houses, where theories about the killer's identity flow as freely as the ale. Some patrons are convinced he's a foreign doctor. Others insist he must be a local butcher with anatomical knowledge. A few progressive thinkers suggest he might be someone from the upper classes, slumming in the East End for sinister purposes. The debates grow heated, but you notice they always return to the same fundamental question. How could someone commit such acts and then simply vanish into the crowd? The letters allegedly sent by the killer to the press and police have added another layer of theater to the proceedings. You witness the morning routine at the local police station, where officers sort through dozens of correspondence from people claiming to be the Ripper, offering confessions, theories, or simply expressing their morbid fascination with the case. Most of these letters are obviously fake, the handwriting too careful, the tone too theatrical, but they must all be filed and catalogued with bureaucratic precision. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, one of the police surgeons examining the victims, has noted that the killer demonstrates some anatomical knowledge, though historians still debate whether this indicates formal medical training or simply the practical experience of someone familiar with butchering animals. You can almost feel the weight of this uncertainty hanging over the investigation, like the persistent London fog. Every clue seems to lead to 3 more questions rather than any definitive answers. The local women have developed their own informal security network, traveling in groups when possible, and establishing signals to warn each other of danger. You observe this quiet cooperation with admiration. They've created their own system of mutual protection without waiting for official assistance. Their solidarity stands in stark contrast to the competitive sensationalism of the newspaper coverage, which treats each new development as another chapter in an ongoing serial drama rather than a series of genuine human tragedies. As you walk through these streets, you begin to understand why the Jack the Ripper case has captured imaginations for over a century. It's not just the mystery of the killer's identity, but the way the crimes revealed the hidden complexities of Victorian society. The stark divide between rich and poor, the vulnerability of women in an unforgiving economic system, and the limitations of both law enforcement and journalism when confronted with something truly unprecedented. The fog swirls around your feet as you continue your evening stroll through these historic streets, where the ordinary and extraordinary intersected in ways that continue to fascinate us more than 100 years later. You find yourself aboard a British naval vessel in 1815, watching the distant outline of St. Helena emerge from the South Atlantic's endless blue expanse like a forgotten chess piece on an oceanic board. The island appears deceptively peaceful from this distance, its volcanic cliffs softened by morning mist, giving no hint that it will become the world's most famous prison for the next 6 years. The salt air carries whispers of the extraordinary cargo you're escorting. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once commanded armies across Europe, now reduced to a single passenger with an unusual amount of luggage and an even more unusual number of complaints about the accommodations. As your ship anchors in Jamestown's tiny harbor, you observe the surprisingly mundane preparations for housing history's most notorious exile. British officials scurry about with clipboards and measuring tapes, transforming Longwood House from a modest country residence into what they hope will be an escape-proof gilded cage. The irony isn't lost on you that the man who once redesigned the map of Europe is now subject to heated debates about curtain placement and garden privileges, though you suspect Napoleon would find the bureaucratic precision rather familiar, given his own obsession with administrative detail. You follow the daily routine that quickly establishes itself at Longwood, where the former emperor of the French discovers that exile is primarily an exercise in crushing boredom, punctuated by moments of theatrical indignation. Napoleon rises each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, a habit ingrained by decades of military campaigns, only to find that his greatest enemy is no longer Austrian artillery or Russian winter, but the simple passage of unmarked time. He spends hours dictating his memoirs to his loyal companions, crafting the narrative of his legacy with the same strategic precision he once applied to battlefield formations. The household routine revolves around elaborate meals that serve as the day's primary entertainment. You watch as Napoleon's chef, despite working with limited island provisions, creates elaborate French dishes that transport the exile back to Versailles banquets and imperial celebrations. These dinners stretch for hours, filled with political discussions, literary debates, and increasingly creative complaints about British hospitality. The former conqueror has discovered that the most effective way to maintain dignity in captivity is to treat every minor inconvenience as a grave diplomatic incident worthy of formal protest. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's various escape plans were serious attempts at freedom or simply elaborate mental exercises designed to stave off depression. You witness the secret meetings where loyal followers sketch boat designs and study tide tables, their whispered conversations creating an atmosphere of conspiracy that seems almost comically disproportionate to their actual resources. The British Guards, meanwhile, maintain their surveillance with the patient professionalism of men who understand that their primary job is not preventing dramatic escapes, but simply ensuring their famous prisoner doesn't die of boredom before his time. The island's social dynamics provide endless fascination as you observe how exile transforms relationships. Napoleon's companions find themselves trapped not just by geography but by loyalty, unable to leave their fallen leader yet increasingly frustrated by his mercurial moods and grandiose reminiscences. Dr. Barry O'Meara, the Irish physician assigned to monitor Napoleon's health, becomes an unwitting intermediary between captive and captor, his medical reports serving as diplomatic communications that reveal as much about politics as physiology. You notice how Napoleon adapts his legendary energy to the constraints of island life, channeling his need for constant activity into remarkably detailed critiques of everything from the quality of the wine to the angle of sunlight in his study. He approaches exile with the same systematic thoroughness he once applied to military campaigns, creating elaborate daily schedules that transform mundane activities into campaigns against tedium. His morning walks become reconnaissance missions. His afternoon reading sessions turn into strategic planning for literary immortality. The correspondence that flows between St. Helena and Europe reveals the peculiar nature of Napoleon's imprisonment. He remains one of the most closely watched men in the world, yet his daily activities consist primarily of playing cards, tending a small garden, and engaging in lengthy philosophical discussions with visitors who arrive on supply ships like exotic birds blown off course. The British government's detailed reports on his behavior read like absurdist theater, documenting with bureaucratic precision whether the former emperor prefers his eggs boiled for 3 minutes or 4. As months turn to years, you observe how exile gradually transforms Napoleon from military genius into something resembling a particularly demanding houseguest with delusions of grandeur. His famous temper now vents itself on household servants who dare to serve his coffee at the wrong temperature, while his strategic mind devotes itself to elaborate schemes for rearranging furniture to maximize both comfort and dignity. The man who once negotiated with kings now finds himself in heated discussions with his housekeeper about laundry schedules, though he approaches these domestic negotiations with the same intensity he once brought to the Treaty of Tilsit. The island's isolation creates its own peculiar rhythm of time, where major world events arrive as distant rumors weeks or months after they occur, filtered through layers of censorship and selective reporting. Napoleon follows European politics like a chess master studying games he can no longer play, his strategic insights now limited to theoretical analysis rather than practical application. You watch him pace his study, dictating responses to political developments that will be obsolete by the time his letters reach their destinations, if they're allowed to leave the island at all. The true genius of Napoleon's St. Helena imprisonment lies not in its physical constraints but in its psychological architecture. The British have created a captivity that maintains all the forms of imperial dignity while systematically emptying them of real meaning. Napoleon continues to hold court, issue proclamations, and maintain the elaborate etiquette of his former position. But these rituals now occur in a drawing room overlooking a garden, rather than in the halls of power that once trembled at his approach. The slow realization that his grand gestures no longer reshape the world provides a kind of philosophical education that no military defeat could have delivered. As you settle into the gentle rhythm of island time, you begin to understand how history's great actors must eventually learn to accept smaller stages. You find yourself settling into a plush velvet armchair in a well-appointed Victorian drawing room, where the evening's entertainment promises to be far more dangerous than the usual piano recital or poetry reading. The year is 1850, and you're attending what polite society calls a testing party, a social gathering where guests compete to identify various poisons using newly available chemical detection kits, turning potentially lethal substances into parlor games with all the casual enthusiasm of a modern wine tasting. The soft gaslight flickers across crystal decanters filled with mysterious powders, each labeled with the kind of elegant calligraphy typically reserved for wedding invitations rather than instruments of murder. Your hostess, Mrs. Pemberton, glides between her guests with the gracious air of someone who has transformed the art of poisoning into a respectable domestic science. She explains each testing procedure with the same gentle authority she might use to describe her prize-winning rose garden, occasionally pausing to adjust the lace doilies that protect her mahogany table from the various acids and reagents scattered across its surface like deadly hors d'oeuvres. The irony of using her finest china to serve potentially fatal substances seems entirely lost on her, though you suspect her cook might have some pointed observations about the wisdom of keeping arsenic next to the sugar bowl. The Victorian fascination with poison reached its peak during this decade, when advances in chemistry made detection both possible and fashionable. You observe how the guests handle their testing vials with the careful precision of scientists, yet their conversations flow with the easy familiarity of people discussing the weather. Mrs. Hartwell mentions that she's recently had her tea service tested after her husband's recurring stomach complaints, while Colonel Morrison shares his theory that his late aunt's mysterious final illness might have been more interesting than the doctors originally suspected. Arsenic, you learn, has become the poison of choice among the criminally minded, partly because of its availability as a rat poison and cosmetic ingredient, but primarily because its symptoms so closely mimic common illnesses that even experienced physicians often miss the signs. The white powder dissolves easily in liquids, has no distinctive taste, and kills slowly enough to allow the poisoner time for elaborate alibis. You listen as Dr. Fernsworth explains the Marsh test, a chemical procedure that can detect arsenic in tissue samples, though he notes with dry academic humor that it's considerably more useful after the victim is dead than before. Historians still debate whether the Victorian poison panic was driven by actual increases in poisoning cases, or simply by improved detection methods that revealed crimes previously attributed to natural causes. The statistical evidence remains frustratingly ambiguous, though you notice that insurance companies have begun requiring medical examinations before issuing policies, suggesting that someone is taking the threat seriously enough to involve actuarial calculations. The social dynamics of these testing parties reveal fascinating insights into Victorian attitudes toward mortality and domestic security. You watch as married couples examine each other's favorite beverages with expressions of scientific curiosity rather than suspicion, as if the possibility of spousal poisoning is simply another household hazard to be managed with proper precautions, like ensuring adequate ventilation or checking the gas fixtures. The conversations flow between technical discussions of chemical reactions and gossip about recent suspicious deaths, creating an atmosphere that's somehow both morbid and remarkably cozy. The evening's entertainment includes a demonstration of the Reinsch test for detecting metallic poisons, performed by Professor Blackwood, with the theatrical flair of a stage magician. He produces a copper wire that changes color when exposed to arsenic solutions, explaining that this simple procedure has already solved several mysterious deaths that had previously been attributed to divine providence or natural constitution. The guests applaud politely, as if they've just witnessed a particularly clever card trick rather than a method for uncovering murder. You examine the various poison detection kits now available for purchase, each packaged with the same marketing sophistication used for patent medicines or household cleaning products. The Blackwood detection system comes complete with detailed instructions, sample bottles, and a small leather-bound notebook for recording results, transforming poison investigation into a hobby suitable for respectable families. The advertising suggests that regular testing of household supplies should be considered as routine as checking the locks or trimming the lamp wicks. The conversation turns to famous poisoning cases, with Mrs. Pemberton recounting the recent trial of Marie Lafarge, with the dramatic flair of someone describing a particularly thrilling novel. The case had introduced the Marsh test to public attention when experts disagreed about whether arsenic found in the victim's body indicated murder or accidental exposure from wallpaper and cosmetics. The legal implications fascinate your fellow guests, who debate whether scientific evidence should override traditional testimony, with the enthusiasm of amateur philosophers exploring abstract principles rather than practical matters of life and death. As the evening progresses, you notice how the combination of scientific methodology and social ritual creates its own peculiar comfort. The guests approach potentially deadly substances with the same calm attention they might give to examining fine porcelain or rare books, their scientific curiosity apparently overwhelming any natural anxiety about handling materials that could kill them within hours. The careful documentation of test results and elegant penmanship suggests that Victorian society has successfully domesticated the concept of poison, transforming it from a source of terror into an object of intellectual interest. The professor concludes the evening with a demonstration of how common household items can be tested for contamination, explaining that many mysterious illnesses might be traced to accidental poisoning from paint, wallpaper, or even fashionable green dresses colored with arsenic compounds. This revelation prompts a flurry of concerned examination of the room's furnishings, though the guests approach this investigation with the same calm thoroughness they've maintained throughout the evening, as if discovering that their drawing room might be slowly killing them is simply another interesting fact to be noted and filed away for future reference. As you bid farewell to your hostess and fellow guests, you reflect on how this strange entertainment reveals something profound about Victorian society's relationship with danger and death. By transforming poison detection into a social activity, they've managed to make the unthinkable seem manageable, applying the same systematic approach they use for all aspects of domestic life to the possibility that someone might be trying to murder them. The soft lamplight follows you into the night, where the gentle sounds of a normal London evening seem particularly precious after spending hours contemplating the subtle art of chemical assassination. You find yourself standing on a wooden platform in the American West, circa 1868, watching steam rise from the locomotive that will carry you into what newspaper writers romantically call bandit country. The morning air carries the scent of coal smoke and possibility, while the rhythmic chuffing of the engine creates a meditation-like soundtrack that will accompany you for the next several hours. Train travel has transformed the art of highway robbery from a desperate gamble into a carefully planned business venture, complete with market research, timing studies, and what modern criminals might recognize as surprisingly sophisticated logistics planning. The transformation of train robbery from romantic adventure to methodical enterprise reflects the broader industrialization of crime during this period. You settle into your velvet-upholstered seat and observe your fellow passengers, a cross-section of American society united by their shared faith in railroad timetables and the assumption that their valuables will arrive at the same destination they do. The wealthy merchant across the aisle clutches his leather satchel with unconscious protectiveness, while the young woman beside you nervously adjusts her jewelry, both unconsciously participating in the peculiar dance between predator and prey that defines this era of transportation. Jesse James and his contemporaries have elevated train robbery to an art form that requires more patience than most legitimate professions. You learn that successful train bandits must study railway schedules with the dedication of amateur historians, memorizing timetables, cargo manifests, and crew rotations until they know the railroad's operations better than many of its own employees. The romantic image of masked horsemen thundering alongside speeding trains obscures the reality that most successful robberies depend on inside information, careful timing, and the kind of bureaucratic knowledge that would make them excellent railway administrators if they'd chosen legal careers. The security measures developed in response to these crimes have created their own industry of protection and surveillance. You notice the armed guards positioned discreetly throughout the train, their casual postures masking constant vigilance. The railroad companies have hired former military officers to design defensive strategies, transforming passenger cars into mobile fortresses equipped with hidden weapon caches and communication systems. These precautions have turned ordinary train journeys into low-level military operations, though the companies market them to passengers as exciting adventures rather than necessary survival measures. Historians still debate whether the famous train robbers were criminal innovators or simply opportunists who recognized that railroads represented concentrated wealth moving predictably through isolated territory. The evidence suggests both interpretations contain truth, as successful bandits combined traditional outlaw skills with emerging technologies and business methods, creating hybrid careers that straddled the line between old-fashioned banditry and modern corporate crime. The psychology of train robbery reveals interesting insights into American attitudes toward progress and tradition during this transitional period. You observe how passengers react to news of recent robberies with a mixture of fear and fascination, discussing the exploits of famous bandits with the same enthusiasm they might show for theatrical performances or sporting events. The robberies serve as exciting interruptions to the monotony of long-distance travel, providing passengers with authentic frontier experiences that validate their sense of participating in America's grand adventure. The methods employed by successful train robbers demonstrate remarkable sophistication in planning and execution. The Reno brothers, pioneers in this specialized field, developed techniques that involved studying not just train schedules, but also the personal habits of conductors, engineers, and guards. They created detailed intelligence networks that would have impressed conventional military strategists, using local contacts to monitor cargo shipments and identify the most profitable targets. Their approach transformed banditry from impulsive violence into calculated risk management, complete with cost-benefit analyses that considered everything from ammunition expenses to horse feed costs. You examine the peculiar economics that made train robbery temporarily profitable during this period. The concentration of valuable cargo in predictable locations, combined with limited law enforcement resources across vast territories, created opportunities that enterprising criminals could exploit with relatively low risk. However, this same predictability that made trains attractive targets also made them easier to defend once railroad companies committed resources to security measures. The arms race between robbers and railroad security resembled a deadly game of chess played across thousands of miles of track. The social impact of train robberies extended far beyond their immediate victims, influencing everything from insurance rates to federal law enforcement policies. You notice how these crimes have sparked debates about government responsibility for protecting interstate commerce, leading to the expansion of federal jurisdiction and the creation of specialized law enforcement agencies. The Pinkerton Detective Agency has built much of its reputation on pursuing train robbers, though their methods sometimes prove as controversial as the crimes they're investigating. The romantic mythology surrounding train robbers obscures their typically brief and violent careers. While newspaper accounts celebrate their daring exploits, you learn that most train robbers operated for only a few years before being killed or captured. The James Younger gang, despite their legendary status, actually committed relatively few train robberies during their entire criminal career, suggesting that their fame rests more on dramatic storytelling than prolific activity. The gap between myth and reality reflects the American public's hunger for frontier adventure stories that validate their sense of living through historically significant times. The decline of train robbery as a viable criminal enterprise demonstrates how quickly technology and organization can eliminate criminal opportunities. Improved communication systems, better trained security forces, and more effective law enforcement cooperation have made train robbery increasingly difficult and dangerous. The same industrial efficiency that made trains attractive targets has ultimately made them too well defended to justify the risks involved, forcing criminals to seek other opportunities that require less specialized knowledge and offer better odds of survival. As your train continues its steady progress across the American landscape, you reflect on how this brief period of railway banditry represents a unique moment when traditional criminal methods intersected with modern transportation technology. The gentle rocking motion of the car and the rhythmic sound of wheels on rails create a soothing atmosphere that makes it easy to forget the violent dramas that once played out along these same routes. The transformation of the American West from lawless frontier to regulated territory unfolds outside your window, visible in the telegraph lines, railway stations, and organized settlements that mark civilization's steady advance across the continent. You find yourself walking through the narrow, winding streets of Edinburgh's Old Town on a particularly foggy November evening in 1827, where the ancient cobblestones glisten with moisture and the gas lamps create amber pools of light that seem to pulse with the city's heartbeat. The air carries that distinctive Scottish blend of coal smoke, whiskey, and something indefinably medicinal that seems to seep from the very stones of this learned city. You're about to witness one of history's most peculiar entrepreneurial ventures, a business so methodically organized that it required detailed accounting ledgers, customer service protocols, and what modern corporations might recognize as sophisticated supply chain management. The partnership between William Burke and William Hare began not with grand criminal ambitions, but with the kind of mundane financial desperation that drives most small business ventures. You observe them in their modest lodging house, two Irish immigrants who discovered that Edinburgh's medical schools would pay handsomely for fresh corpses, no questions asked. The demand for anatomical specimens far exceeded the legal supply from executed criminals, creating a market opportunity that Burke and Hare approached with the systematic thoroughness of experienced merchants identifying an underserved niche. What strikes you most about their operation is its remarkable organization and attention to customer satisfaction. Burke maintains detailed records of their transactions, noting which medical schools pay the best prices, which professors are most discreet about procurement methods, and which delivery times minimize the risk of detection. Their business model relies on consistent quality and reliable service rather than dramatic gestures, making them the kind of vendors that institutional customers learn to depend upon for their specialized needs. Dr. Robert Knox, the anatomist who became their primary customer, represents the peculiar ethical blindness that characterized academic medicine during this period. You watch him examine their deliveries with the professional detachment of someone who has learned not to inquire too closely about procurement methods, treating each corpse as educational material rather than evidence of criminal activity. His willingness to pay premium prices for unusually fresh specimens suggests that he understands the nature of his suppliers' work without feeling obligated to investigate their methods, a form of intellectual compartmentalization that would make modern compliance officers deeply uncomfortable. The transformation from grave robbing to murder reveals how easily business enterprises can drift into increasingly unethical territory when market pressures overcome moral constraints. Burke and Hare initially focused on digging up recently buried bodies, work that required considerable physical effort and careful timing, but relatively little violence. However, the demand for fresher specimens and the practical difficulties of cemetery excavation gradually led them toward what business analysts might recognize as vertical integration, controlling their entire supply chain from production to delivery. Historians still debate whether Burke and Hare killed 16 people or significantly more, though the uncertainty reflects less about evidence gaps than about the challenge of distinguishing between natural deaths they exploited and murders they committed. Their victims were typically elderly, poor, or intoxicated individuals whose disappearances attracted minimal attention from authorities or family members. This targeting strategy demonstrates a coldly practical understanding of social vulnerabilities that would be familiar to modern criminologists studying victim selection patterns. The social dynamics surrounding their business reveal fascinating insights into Edinburgh's class structure and medical establishment. You notice how the city's respectable citizens maintain elaborate mental barriers between their admiration for scientific progress and curiosity about the methods necessary to achieve it. The medical students who attend Dr. Knox's anatomy lectures understand that their education depends on a steady supply of bodies, but they prefer not to examine too closely how those bodies arrive at the dissection tables looking so remarkably well preserved. The investigation that eventually exposed Burke and Hare demonstrates the limitations of early 19th century forensic science and police work. When suspicious neighbors finally reported their activities, the authorities discovered a criminal enterprise that had operated with remarkable efficiency for nearly a year. The evidence collected reveals business practices that included customer testimonials, repeat client relationships, and what modern investigators might recognize as sophisticated operational security measures designed to minimize detection risks. The trial of William Burke became a public sensation that revealed Victorian society's complex attitudes toward scientific progress and moral responsibility. You observe the crowds gathering outside the courthouse, drawn by the same morbid fascination that makes their crimes continue to captivate audiences nearly 2 centuries later. The proceedings demonstrate how legal systems struggle to address crimes that violate social norms while serving institutional needs that society considers essential for progress and education. The partnership's dissolution followed predictable patterns of criminal collaboration under pressure. When faced with arrest, Hare agreed to testify against Burke in exchange for immunity, a decision that reflected practical self-interest rather than moral awakening. Their relationship deteriorated with the same petty acrimony that characterizes many failed business partnerships, complete with disputes over profit sharing and accusations of incompetent management that seem almost comedically mundane given the nature of their enterprise. Burke's execution drew enormous crowds who treated the event as both moral vindication and public entertainment. The irony that his body was subsequently donated to medical science for anatomical dissection was not lost on contemporary observers, who noted that Burke finally experienced the fate he had inflicted on his victims. This poetic justice satisfied the public's sense of moral balance, while ensuring that his death continued to serve the educational purposes that had motivated his crimes. The long-term impact of the Burke and Hare case extended far beyond criminal justice, influencing medical education policies and body procurement regulations that persist in modified forms today. Their crimes demonstrated how market incentives could corrupt scientific institutions, leading to regulatory reforms designed to ensure adequate legal supplies of anatomical specimens. The Anatomy Act of 1832, passed partly in response to their activities, established procedures for obtaining bodies legally while reducing the financial incentives that had made body snatching profitable. As you walk through these historic Edinburgh streets, the fog swirling around the ancient buildings like ghostly memories of past secrets, you begin to understand how Burke and Hare's systematic approach to crime reflects broader themes about commerce, morality, and social responsibility. Their story reveals how ordinary people can drift into extraordinary evil when institutional demands create market opportunities that override ethical constraints, a pattern that continues to resonate in modern discussions about corporate responsibility and professional ethics. The gentle Scottish mist seems to carry whispers of all the city's buried secrets, reminding you that beneath every civilized society lurk the uncomfortable compromises that make progress possible. You find yourself seated at a mahogany desk in a dimly lit workshop somewhere in London's financial district, where the gentle scratch of steel engraving plates creates a rhythmic symphony that could easily lull you to sleep. The year is 1844, and you're witnessing one of the most patient crimes in human history, the art of counterfeiting currency, a profession that requires more dedication to detail than most legitimate occupations, and considerably more artistic talent than the average banking career. The soft gaslight flickers across sheets of carefully prepared paper, each one destined to become a masterpiece of criminal craftsmanship that would make Renaissance artists weep with envy. Your host for the evening is James Whitman, though that's certainly not his real name, a gentleman forger whose work is so meticulous that bank clerks have been known to reject genuine notes in favor of his superior reproductions. He approaches counterfeiting with the scholarly dedication of an academic researcher, maintaining extensive libraries of currency samples, technical manuals, and reference materials that would make legitimate banknote designers deeply uncomfortable. His workshop resembles a cross between an artist's studio and a chemistry laboratory, filled with the specialized tools and materials that transform paper and ink into financial instruments worth more than most people's annual salaries. The process begins with paper preparation, a procedure so tedious that it makes watching paint dry seem like thrilling entertainment. Whitman explains that authentic banknote paper contains specific fibers and watermarks that must be replicated exactly, requiring him to develop his own manufacturing techniques that often take months to perfect. He sources cotton rags from the same regions used by legitimate currency printers, then processes them through chemical treatments that he's developed through years of experimentation that would qualify him for advanced degrees in both chemistry and textile engineering. The engraving work represents the true artistry of counterfeiting, requiring skills that most legitimate engravers would struggle to match. You watch as Whitman carves microscopic details into steel plates, each line requiring the steady hand of a surgeon and the patience of a medieval monk illuminating manuscripts. The intricate scrollwork and portrait details that protect legitimate currency from forgery become his greatest challenges and most satisfying achievements, though he notes with dry humor that his masterpieces will never hang in galleries or earn him critical recognition. Historians still debate whether the golden age of counterfeiting drove improvements in currency security, or whether security improvements created opportunities for more sophisticated forgers, though the evidence suggests both processes reinforced each other in an escalating arms race between criminals and monetary authorities. The Bank of England's introduction of increasingly complex security features has paradoxically made counterfeiting both more difficult and more profitable for those skilled enough to meet the challenge. The chemistry involved in creating authentic-looking inks requires knowledge that would qualify Whitman for positions in legitimate printing establishments, if he weren't already committed to his current career path. He maintains detailed notebooks recording formulas for dozens of different ink compositions, each designed to replicate the specific colors and chemical properties used by various national currencies. His laboratory contains equipment for spectral analysis and chemical testing that rivals facilities used by legitimate currency designers, though his research methods involve considerably more secrecy and significantly less institutional support. The social networks surrounding professional counterfeiting reveal surprising levels of organization and specialization. You discover that Whitman rarely works alone, instead collaborating with specialists who focus on specific aspects of the forgery process. Paper suppliers, ink chemists, engraving artists, and distribution networks form complex criminal ecosystems that operate with the efficiency of legitimate businesses, complete with quality control procedures and customer service standards that would impress modern corporate managers. The economics of counterfeiting during this period created peculiar market dynamics that economists might find fascinating if they weren't so illegal. Successful counterfeiters must balance production costs against detection risks, creating business models that require careful analysis of profit margins, market demand, and law enforcement capabilities. Whitman explains that producing convincing forgeries often costs nearly as much as the face value of the authentic currency, making counterfeiting profitable only for high-denomination notes that justify the enormous investment in time and materials. The distribution challenges faced by counterfeiters reveal interesting insights into Victorian commercial networks and social trust mechanisms. Even perfect forgeries become worthless if they can't be introduced into circulation without arousing suspicion, requiring counterfeiters to develop sophisticated understanding of banking procedures, merchant practices, and regional economic patterns that would qualify them for careers in legitimate finance if they'd chosen different paths. The psychological aspects of counterfeiting attract practitioners who combine artistic temperament with entrepreneurial ambition and criminal ethics, creating personalities that fascinate contemporary observers. Whitman discusses his work with the pride of a craftsman, whose skills have achieved levels of excellence that few legitimate practitioners could match, though he acknowledges that his achievements will never receive public recognition or professional accolades that might validate his expertise. The investigation techniques developed to combat counterfeiting have driven innovations in forensic science and evidence analysis that extend far beyond currency crimes. You learn that banknote examination has become a specialized field, requiring expertise in chemistry, materials science, and microscopic analysis that rivals techniques used in academic research institutions. The methods developed to detect forged currency have applications in authenticating historical documents, artwork, and other materials where provenance and authenticity matter more than monetary value. The international dimensions of counterfeiting during this period reflect the growing interconnectedness of global financial systems and the challenges of enforcing laws across national boundaries. Successful counterfeiters often target foreign currencies that local authorities are less familiar with, exploiting knowledge gaps and jurisdictional limitations that make detection and prosecution more difficult. The diplomatic complications arising from international counterfeiting cases have influenced treaties and law enforcement cooperation agreements that persist in modified forms today. The decline of traditional counterfeiting methods reflects broader technological changes that have made hand-engraved forgeries obsolete, while creating new opportunities for digital reproduction techniques. Whitman represents the last generation of craftsman counterfeiters, whose work required years of training and artistic development, giving way to industrial methods that emphasize technical precision over individual artistry. His workshop, with its hand-carved plates and carefully mixed inks, seems almost quaint compared to modern counterfeiting operations that rely on computer technology and mass production techniques. As you observe Whitman putting the finishing touches on his latest masterpiece, you're struck by the contradiction between his obvious talent and his chosen application for those skills. The gentle sounds of his engraving tools against metal create a meditative rhythm that makes it easy to forget the criminal nature of his work, transforming counterfeiting into something resembling traditional handicraft, practiced by medieval artisans in their quiet workshops. The soft lamplight illuminates his concentrated expression as he adds final details that will make his forgery indistinguishable from authentic currency, representing countless hours of patient labor that would earn him comfortable living in almost any legitimate profession he might choose to pursue instead. You find yourself seated in a mahogany chair within the War Ministry in Paris, circa 1894, where the soft rustle of papers creates a gentle symphony of bureaucratic efficiency that seems almost hypnotic in its methodical rhythm. The autumn light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows across endless rows of filing cabinets that contain the accumulated secrets of the French Republic. You're about to witness how a single piece of misplaced correspondence can unravel a man's life with the same devastating precision that an avalanche transforms a peaceful mountain morning into chaos, though with considerably more paperwork and significantly less dramatic scenery. The Dreyfus Affair begins not with dramatic accusations or courtroom theatrics, but with the discovery of a torn document in a wastebasket at the German embassy, a piece of evidence so mundane that it initially attracts less attention than the daily delivery of office supplies. You observe the meticulous process by which French intelligence officers piece together this fragmentary correspondence, working with the patient dedication of scholars reconstructing ancient manuscripts, unaware that their careful detective work will ultimately expose the limitations of their own investigative methods, rather than foreign espionage activities. Captain Alfred Dreyfus enters this bureaucratic labyrinth as an unremarkable artillery officer, whose primary distinction lies in his methodical approach to military paperwork and his unfortunate tendency to ask detailed questions about procedures that his colleagues prefer to handle through informal arrangements. You watch him navigate the social complexities of the French officer corps, where his Jewish background and Alsatian origins make him perpetually suspect, despite his obvious competence and unwavering loyalty to the Republic that his accusers claim he has betrayed. The investigation that destroys Dreyfus's career demonstrates how institutional prejudice can masquerade as scientific methodology when supported by impressive amounts of documentation. You observe the handwriting analysis sessions where experts compare his penmanship to the intercepted document, with the scholarly intensity of medieval theologians debating angels dancing on pinheads, their conclusions predetermined by assumptions they refuse to acknowledge, even when the evidence points toward more uncomfortable truths about their colleagues' loyalty and competence. Historians still debate whether the military officers who prosecuted Dreyfus genuinely believed in his guilt or simply needed a convenient scapegoat to protect more valuable intelligence assets, though the surviving correspondence suggests that institutional self-preservation ultimately mattered more than individual justice. The documents reveal decision-making processes that prioritized organizational reputation over factual accuracy, creating a feedback loop where initial mistakes became increasingly difficult to correct without admitting systematic failures that would embarrass powerful people who preferred to remain undisturbed. The court-martial proceedings unfold with the ceremonial dignity that French institutions bring to all their formal activities, complete with elaborate protocols that transform judicial inquiry into theatrical performance. You witness testimony sessions where witnesses present their evidence with the confident authority of people who have confused their institutional positions with personal expertise, while defense attorneys struggle against procedural restrictions that limit their ability to examine the evidence that supposedly justifies their client's conviction. The degradation ceremony that strips Dreyfus of his military rank provides a disturbing glimpse into how societies ritualize the destruction of individuals who have become inconvenient for institutional narratives. You observe the choreographed humiliation that transforms a respected officer into a public symbol of treachery, complete with carefully scripted denunciations that allow spectators to participate in collective moral judgment without examining the evidence that supposedly supports their righteous indignation. Devil's Island emerges from the South American coast like a bureaucratic nightmare made manifest in tropical vegetation and administrative isolation. You follow Dreyfus into this humid prison, where the French government has perfected the art of making punishment seem both inevitable and forgettable, creating conditions that ensure their inconvenient prisoner will disappear from public consciousness without requiring the dramatic finality that might attract unwanted attention from journalists or international observers. The daily routine of solitary confinement demonstrates how psychological torture can be administered through perfectly legal administrative procedures that leave no physical evidence of systematic cruelty. You watch Dreyfus maintain his sanity through rigid adherence to personal schedules that impose order on circumstances designed to eliminate any sense of control or purpose. His letters home revealing a man determined to preserve his identity despite institutional efforts to erase his existence from collective memory. The evidence that eventually exonerates Dreyfus accumulates through the patient work of individuals who refuse to accept institutional conclusions that contradict their own observations and moral instincts. You observe Lieutenant Colonel Picart as he discovers documents that point toward the real traitor, Major Esterhazy, whose handwriting matches the intercepted correspondence with suspicious precision that suggests the original investigation was either incompetent or deliberately misleading from its very beginning. The political crisis that transforms the Dreyfus case from military scandal into national obsession reveals deep fissures within French society that had been temporarily papered over by Republican rhetoric and institutional stability. You witness family dinner conversations that dissolve into bitter arguments about patriotism, justice, and social order, as the case becomes a lens through which different groups examine their competing visions of what France should represent in the modern world. Émile Zola's famous J'accuse letter demonstrates how individual courage can challenge institutional power when combined with access to public communication channels and willingness to accept personal consequences for speaking uncomfortable truths. You observe the literary establishment's response to Zola's intervention, where artistic reputation intersects with political conviction in ways that reveal how intellectual freedom depends on economic independence and social networks that can provide protection against official retaliation. The eventual vindication of Dreyfus occurs through the same bureaucratic processes that initially condemned him. though the rehabilitation procedures demonstrate how institutions can acknowledge their mistakes without accepting responsibility for the systematic failures that made those mistakes possible. You watch the careful legal maneuvering that restores his rank and honors, while avoiding admissions of wrongdoing that might encourage other victims of institutional injustice to seek similar remedies through expensive and embarrassing legal proceedings. The long-term impact of the Dreyfus Affair extends far beyond the fate of a single army officer, influencing French political development, international relations, and legal procedures in ways that continue to resonate more than a century later. The case established precedents for civilian oversight of military justice, press freedom during national security investigations, and individual rights protection that have shaped democratic institutions throughout the modern world. Though the implementation of these principles remains frustratingly incomplete, even in societies that explicitly embrace them. As you close the final filing cabinet containing the accumulated documentation of this extraordinary case, the soft sound of papers settling into their folders creates a gentle whisper that seems to carry echoes of all the quiet conversations, private doubts, and institutional compromises that transformed a simple case of mistaken identity into a defining moment in the struggle between individual justice and collective security. The evening light fades through the ministry windows, casting long shadows that remind you how easily truth can be obscured by the very procedures designed to illuminate it, while the rhythmic ticking of the office clock marks the steady passage of time that eventually reveals all secrets, no matter how carefully bureaucracies attempt to bury them. You find yourself settling into a plush velvet chair in a dimly lit Victorian parlor, where heavy curtains block out the afternoon sun and the air carries the intoxicating blend of lavender water, burning candles, and something indefinably mysterious that seems to emanate from the very wallpaper. The year is 1872, and you're about to witness one of the era's most profitable theatrical performances, a séance conducted by Madame Theodora, whose ability to communicate with the departed has made her wealthy enough to afford the kind of furniture that most people only see in museums, though her accounting books reveal business practices that would make modern tax advisors deeply uncomfortable. The preparation for each séance demonstrates organizational skills that would impress contemporary event planners, complete with detailed client files, careful staging arrangements, and what modern marketers might recognize as sophisticated customer relationship management. You observe Madame Theodora reviewing her notes on tonight's participants, studying their family histories, recent losses, and psychological vulnerabilities with the methodical attention of a scholar preparing for comprehensive examinations. Her assistant, Miss Cordelia, arranges the props with the precision of a stage manager, ensuring that every candle flame flickers at exactly the right angle, and every mysterious sound effect will occur on cue. The clients who gather around the mahogany table represent a cross-section of Victorian society, united by their shared hunger for contact with deceased loved ones and their willingness to pay premium prices for spiritual consolation. You watch Mrs. Pemberton clutch her late husband's photograph, with the desperate intensity of someone who refuses to accept that death might actually be permanent, while Colonel Ashworth maintains the stiff upper lip that his military training demands, even when discussing conversations with his departed son who fell at Balaclava. The business model underlying professional spiritualism reveals fascinating insights into Victorian attitudes toward death, science, and commercial entertainment. Madame Theodora charges fees comparable to legal consultations or medical examinations, positioning her services as professional expertise rather than mere entertainment, though her client testimonials read like theatrical reviews rather than medical case studies. The repeat customers who attend regular sessions demonstrate that grief creates reliable revenue streams for those skilled enough to provide convincing performances that offer emotional satisfaction without requiring actual supernatural intervention. Historians still debate whether prominent mediums like Madame Theodora genuinely believed in their abilities or simply recognized profitable opportunities to exploit human psychological needs. though the surviving business records suggest that financial considerations ultimately mattered more than metaphysical convictions. The detailed accounting that tracks séance revenues, prop expenses, and customer acquisition costs reveals entrepreneurial thinking that would be familiar to any modern service industry professional, complete with seasonal variations that reflect how grief patterns fluctuate with holiday schedules and family anniversary dates. The theatrical techniques employed during séances demonstrate remarkable sophistication in psychological manipulation and stagecraft. You witness Madame Theodora's masterful use of cold reading techniques, drawing information from clients through seemingly casual conversation, before reflecting their own words back to them as messages from beyond the grave. Her assistant operates mechanical devices hidden throughout the room that create mysterious sounds, moving objects, and temperature changes that convince participants they're experiencing genuine supernatural phenomena rather than elaborate stage magic performed in intimate settings. The social dynamics of séance participation reveal Victorian society's complex relationship with scientific rationality and emotional needs that conventional religion struggled to address adequately. You observe how educated, sophisticated people temporarily suspend their critical thinking skills when offered hope of communication with deceased relatives, their willingness to believe overriding skepticism that they would normally apply to any other extraordinary claims requiring similar leaps of faith and financial investment. The investigation techniques developed by skeptical researchers demonstrate early applications of scientific methodology to supernatural claims, though the results often convince believers that scientific instruments simply cannot detect spiritual phenomena, rather than proving that such phenomena don't exist. The Society for Psychical Research conducts elaborate tests of mediums using controlled conditions and careful documentation, though their findings typically satisfy neither true believers nor complete skeptics, instead creating middle ground where uncertainty flourishes and debate continues indefinitely. The correspondence between mediums reveals professional networks that share techniques, client information, and business strategies with the same collegial cooperation found in any specialized industry. You discover that successful spiritualists maintain detailed databases of deceased individuals in their communities, allowing them to provide convincing details about people they never met while alive but researched thoroughly through obituaries, church records, and local gossip networks that function as informal intelligence services. The legal challenges faced by professional mediums illustrate the difficulties of regulating industries that operate in gray areas between entertainment, counseling, and fraud. Prosecution requires proving intent to deceive, rather than simply demonstrating that supernatural claims cannot be scientifically verified, creating evidentiary burdens that make successful convictions rare, even when the deceptive nature of the performances seems obvious to objective observers. The resulting legal precedents have influenced consumer protection laws and professional licensing requirements that persist in modified forms today. The international dimensions of Victorian spiritualism reflect the global communication networks that allowed spiritual movements to spread across national boundaries with remarkable speed. Mediums travel between cities and countries, sharing techniques and building reputations that transcend local markets, while spiritual publications circulate testimonials and techniques that standardize practices across different cultures and languages. The movement's growth demonstrates how technological improvements in transportation and communication can accelerate the spread of ideas, regardless of their factual accuracy or practical utility. The decline of traditional séance practices reflects broader cultural changes that have made Victorian-style spiritualism seem quaint rather than threatening to established religious and scientific authorities. Modern grief counseling, psychology, and bereavement support services have provided alternative approaches to dealing with loss that offer practical help without requiring supernatural explanations, though the basic human needs that drove Victorian spiritualism persist in contemporary forms that might surprise people who consider themselves too sophisticated for such obviously theatrical deceptions. The economic impact of spiritualism during its Victorian heyday created entire industries around death-related services that extended far beyond individual mediums and private séances. Publishers produced specialized literature, manufacturers created specialized equipment, and entrepreneurs developed business models that capitalized on grief, while providing services that many customers found genuinely helpful, regardless of their supernatural authenticity. The movement generated enough revenue to support professional organizations, training programs, and regulatory structures that treated spiritualism as a legitimate service industry, rather than elaborate confidence game. As the evening's séance concludes with appropriately mysterious flourishes and satisfied customers departing with renewed hope for continued relationships with their deceased loved ones, you reflect on how Madame Theodora's elaborate performance reveals deep truths about human psychology and social needs that extend far beyond questions of supernatural authenticity. The soft candlelight flickers across her satisfied expression as she counts the evening's receipts, her business success demonstrating that people will pay premium prices for services that provide emotional comfort regardless of their metaphysical foundations. The gentle sounds of departing carriages fade into the night, carrying clients who feel they've received genuine value for their investment in professional consolation that acknowledges their losses while offering hope for continued connection across the ultimate boundary that separates the living from the dead. You find yourself aboard a merchant vessel anchored in Hong Kong's harbor during the summer of 1839, where the gentle lapping of waves against the hull creates a rhythmic lullaby that competes with the soft sounds of commerce drifting across the water. The air carries the exotic blend of sandalwood, sea salt, and something sweet that you gradually realize is the scent of processed opium being loaded into cargo holds with the same methodical care that other merchants might reserve for fine china or precious silks. You're witnessing the intersection of international diplomacy and organized crime, where gentlemen in top hats conduct drug trafficking operations through proper paperwork and polite correspondence that would make modern corporate executives envious of their professional etiquette. The opium trade demonstrates how criminal enterprises can achieve respectability through bureaucratic legitimacy and government sponsorship, transforming what would be considered drug dealing in any other context into patriotic commercial activity that generates tax revenue and supports imperial expansion. You observe British merchants maintaining meticulous shipping manifests that document their cargo, with the same attention to detail that legitimate traders might use for any other valuable commodity, though their customers happen to be purchasing substances that will ultimately destroy millions of lives across an entire civilization. The East India Company's approach to opium cultivation in Bengal reveals the systematic efficiency that characterizes all successful criminal organizations, complete with quality control procedures, production quotas, and distribution networks that span thousands of miles. You watch clerks in Calcutta processing orders from Chinese dealers with the same professional courtesy they might show to customers purchasing textiles or spices, their correspondents maintaining the polite fiction that everyone involved is engaged in perfectly legitimate international commerce, rather than systematic poisoning of foreign populations. The Chinese government's attempts to regulate opium importation demonstrate the challenges that legitimate authorities face when confronting criminal enterprises that enjoy foreign government protection and superior military technology. You witness the frustration of Chinese officials who discover that their traditional diplomatic approaches prove ineffective against merchants who treat trade regulations as obstacles to be overcome through bribery, smuggling, or military intervention, rather than legal constraints that deserve respectful compliance. Commissioner Lin Zexu's dramatic destruction of confiscated opium supplies in Canton represents one of history's most expensive drug seizures, though the British response demonstrates how criminal organizations can weaponize concepts of free trade and property rights to justify military retaliation against law enforcement efforts. The sight of millions of dollars worth of drugs dissolving into the Pearl River creates a spectacle that would impress modern drug enforcement agencies, though the political consequences prove that destroying criminal assets sometimes matters less than the international power dynamics that protect criminal enterprises from meaningful prosecution. Historians still debate whether the opium wars represent legitimate conflicts over trade rights or simply military campaigns designed to protect international drug trafficking operations, though the documentary evidence suggests that British officials understood exactly what they were fighting to defend. The correspondence between London and Hong Kong reveals government leaders who discuss opium revenues with the same practical matter-of-factness they might apply to any other colonial taxation scheme, treating drug profits as necessary components of imperial finance rather than morally problematic income sources. The social impact of widespread opium addiction in China creates human tragedy on a scale that dwarfs most individual criminal enterprises, though the international nature of the trade makes it difficult to assign responsibility to specific individuals or organizations. You observe Chinese families destroyed by addiction that began with legitimate medical treatment, but gradually consumed entire household economies, creating cycles of dependency that benefit foreign merchants while devastating local communities that lack resources to address the resulting social problems. The treaty negotiations that conclude the First Opium War demonstrate how military victory can transform criminal enterprises into legal commercial activities through diplomatic agreements that legitimize previously illegal behavior. The Treaty of Nanking forces China to accept opium importation as a legitimate trade activity, while paying war reparations to the same foreign powers that created the drug crisis in the first place, establishing precedents for international law that prioritize commercial interests over public health concerns. The development of Hong Kong as a British colony reflects the strategic importance of maintaining secure bases for criminal operations that might face interference from legitimate governments concerned about their citizens' welfare. You watch the transformation of a fishing village into an international commercial hub designed primarily to facilitate drug trafficking, though the economic benefits eventually extend to other forms of trade that provide the colony with sufficient legitimate commerce to obscure its origins as a criminal enterprise headquarters. The American merchants who participate in the opium trade demonstrate how criminal enterprises can attract respectable participants when the profits are sufficiently large and the legal risks remain manageable. Prominent Boston and New York trading families invest in opium shipments with the same casual confidence they might show toward any other speculative investment, their account books treating drug profits as routine business income that contributes to family fortunes that will eventually fund universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions. The technological innovations developed to support opium trafficking include improvements in ship design, navigation techniques, and cargo handling procedures that benefit legitimate maritime commerce, even when applied to criminal purposes. The fast clipper ships built for opium running demonstrate superior performance that eventually influences commercial shipbuilding throughout the industry. Though their original purpose was evading Chinese customs enforcement rather than improving general transportation efficiency, a bit like developing race cars primarily for bank robberies. The banking networks that process opium revenues create financial infrastructure that supports both criminal and legitimate international commerce, demonstrating how money laundering operations can evolve into respected financial institutions when they achieve sufficient scale and social acceptance. The merchant banks that handle drug profits eventually become pillars of international finance, their criminal origins forgotten as they develop reputations for discretion and reliability that attract customers who care more about service quality than historical ethics. The diplomatic complexities surrounding opium regulation reveal how international law struggles to address criminal enterprises that enjoy government protection and operate across multiple jurisdictions with conflicting interests and enforcement capabilities. The negotiations between British and Chinese officials create legal precedents that influence international commerce regulation for decades afterward, though the fundamental tensions between criminal profits and public welfare continue to complicate international law enforcement efforts. The long-term consequences of the opium trade extend far beyond its immediate participants, influencing Chinese political development international relations, and global attitudes toward drug regulation in ways that continue to shape contemporary policy debates. The social devastation caused by mass addiction contributes to political instability that facilitates foreign intervention and domestic upheaval, creating cycles of crisis that benefit some international interests while imposing enormous costs on Chinese society that persist for generations after the original trade agreements expire. As you watch the sun set over Hong Kong Harbor, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink that reflect peacefully on the water's surface, you reflect on how this beautiful scene conceals one of history's most systematically destructive criminal enterprises. The gentle evening breeze carries the sounds of normal commercial activity that masks the underlying reality of an international drug trafficking operation that will ultimately contribute to the collapse of one of the world's oldest civilizations. The rhythmic sounds of waves against the harbor walls create a peaceful soundtrack that seems to whisper of all the quiet compromises and institutional failures that allow criminal enterprises to flourish when they serve powerful interests, reminding you that even the most tranquil settings can conceal the most devastating human tragedies. You find yourself walking through the gaslit streets of Chicago on a crisp autumn evening in 1875, where the steady rhythm of your footsteps on wooden sidewalks mingles with the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the soft whistle of steam from nearby factories. The air carries that distinctive American blend of coal smoke, fresh lumber, and something indefinably hopeful that seems to rise from the very soil of this rapidly growing city. You're about to witness the birth of modern detective work, where the romantic image of brilliant investigators solving crimes through flashes of inspiration gives way to the far more mundane reality of careful note-taking, systematic surveillance, and what contemporary business analysts might recognize as surprisingly sophisticated data management techniques. The Pinkerton Detective Agency operates from a modest brick building that could easily be mistaken for an insurance office or accounting firm, its unremarkable exterior concealing what has become America's first truly professional private investigation service. You observe Alan Pinkerton reviewing case files with the methodical attention of a librarian, cataloging rare manuscripts. His famous motto, "We never sleep," reflecting not dramatic heroism, but rather the bureaucratic persistence that characterizes successful detective work in the industrial age. The agency's success depends less on individual brilliance than on systematic record-keeping and organizational efficiency that would make modern corporate managers deeply envious of their operational procedures. The transformation of detective work from amateur pursuit to professional service reflects broader changes in American society, where traditional community-based law enforcement proves inadequate for addressing crimes that cross state boundaries and involve sophisticated criminal organizations. You watch Pinkerton operatives preparing for assignments with the same methodical attention to detail that traveling salesmen might use when planning their routes, complete with expense accounts, communication schedules, and detailed reporting requirements that transform crime-solving into a form of mobile office work. The agency's approach to criminal investigation emphasizes surveillance and intelligence gathering over dramatic confrontations, creating a profession that requires more patience than most legitimate jobs and considerably more paperwork than popular fiction suggests. You observe agents spending days observing suspects' daily routines, documenting their activities with the obsessive thoroughness of amateur naturalists studying exotic birds. Their surveillance logs, reading like incredibly boring diaries that somehow reveal profound insights into human behavior patterns and criminal planning methods. The case files maintained by Pinkerton operatives demonstrate remarkable attention to detail and systematic organization that would impress modern database administrators. Each investigation generates volumes of documentation that tracks suspects' movements, financial transactions, personal relationships, and behavioral patterns with scientific precision, creating information resources that often prove more valuable than physical evidence for understanding criminal enterprises and predicting future activities. The agency's archives become repositories of American criminal history that rival government intelligence services for comprehensiveness and analytical sophistication. Historians still debate whether the Pinkerton Agency's methods represented legitimate law enforcement innovation or early examples of corporate surveillance overreach, though the documentary evidence suggests both interpretations contain elements of truth. The agency's willingness to work for private clients rather than government authorities creates potential conflicts of interest that blur traditional distinctions between law enforcement and private security, establishing precedents for corporate detective work that continue to influence contemporary discussions about privacy rights and commercial surveillance. The training provided to Pinkerton operatives transforms detective work from intuitive art into systematic profession, complete with standardized procedures, performance evaluations, and continuing education requirements that treat criminal investigation as a technical skill requiring ongoing development. You witness training sessions where experienced agents teach newcomers surveillance techniques, interview methods, and report writing procedures with the same scholarly attention that university professors might devote to academic subjects, though the practical applications involve considerably more personal danger and legal complexity. The agency's involvement in labor disputes reveals how detective services can serve corporate interests that extend far beyond traditional criminal investigation, creating ethical complications that persist in contemporary discussions about private security and corporate intelligence gathering. Pinkerton agents infiltrate union organizations with the same systematic thoroughness they apply to criminal enterprises, their reports documenting labor activities with scientific precision that helps corporate clients anticipate and counter worker organizing efforts that might otherwise succeed through surprise and collective action. The international operations conducted by Pinkerton agents demonstrate how American detective methods influence law enforcement practices worldwide, though the export of surveillance techniques raises questions about cultural sensitivity and legal jurisdiction that modern international security services continue to address. The agency's work in Canada, Europe, and Latin America establishes precedents for cross-border investigation that require diplomatic coordination and legal expertise that transform detective work into a form of unofficial international relations. The technology employed by Pinkerton operatives includes early applications of photography, telegraphy, and systematic record-keeping that revolutionize criminal investigation while creating new opportunities for evidence manipulation and privacy invasion. You observe agents using cameras to document crime scenes and suspect activities with scientific precision, though the equipment requires such careful handling that photography becomes a specialized skill requiring extensive training and expensive equipment that limits its practical applications, rather like trying to conduct surveillance using equipment designed for studio portraits. The psychological profiles developed by experienced Pinkerton agents reveal early applications of behavioral analysis to criminal investigation, creating investigative techniques that anticipate modern forensic psychology while relying primarily on systematic observation rather than theoretical frameworks. The agent reports describe criminal personalities and behavioral patterns with analytical precision that helps predict suspect actions and identify potential accomplices, though the methods remain primarily intuitive rather than scientifically validated. The correspondence between Pinkerton headquarters and field operatives creates communication networks that coordinate complex investigations across vast geographical areas, demonstrating organizational capabilities that rival those of major corporations or government agencies. The telegraph messages and written reports that flow between different offices create information systems that allow real-time coordination of surveillance activities and strategic planning that would be familiar to modern law enforcement administrators, though the technology requires considerably more patience and significantly higher costs than contemporary communication methods. The legal challenges faced by Pinkerton operatives illustrate the complex relationship between private detective work and official law enforcement, creating jurisdictional questions that continue to influence discussions about civilian involvement in criminal investigation. The agency's agents often operate in legal gray areas where their authority depends more on client authorization than government sanction. creating potential conflicts with local law enforcement that require diplomatic skills and legal expertise that transform detective work into a form of quasi-official diplomacy. The social impact of professional detective services extends beyond individual criminal cases, influencing public attitudes toward privacy, security, and law enforcement in ways that shape American political development throughout the late 19th century. The knowledge that private investigators can be hired to conduct surveillance creates new forms of social anxiety, while providing security services that help protect legitimate business interests from criminal interference, establishing market dynamics that continue to influence contemporary discussions about corporate security and individual privacy rights. As you walk through the quiet Chicago streets toward your hotel, the soft gaslight creating pools of amber warmth that push back against the gathering dusk, you reflect on how the Pinkerton Agency's systematic approach to detective work represents a fundamental shift from traditional law enforcement toward modern investigative methods. The gentle sounds of the evening city, distant conversations, horse hooves on cobblestones, the whistle of a late train, create a peaceful soundtrack that makes it easy to forget the complex social changes occurring beneath the surface of this rapidly modernizing society. The methodical transformation of crime solving from dramatic individual heroics into systematic organizational procedures unfolds around you like a quiet revolution that will ultimately reshape American attitudes toward security, privacy, and the relationship between individual rights and collective safety. You find yourself standing on Westminster Bridge in the summer of 1858, where the Thames flows beneath you like a sluggish brown ribbon, carrying the accumulated secrets of London's 4 million inhabitants toward the sea. The morning air hangs heavy and still, creating an atmospheric pressure that seems to press against your chest with the weight of impending revelation. What strikes you most isn't the gentle lapping of water against the stone embankments or the soft clip-clop of horses crossing the bridge, but rather the absence of something you can't quite identify until you realize it's the smell. Or more precisely, the overwhelming, suffocating, absolutely magnificent stench that has been London's unwelcome companion for the past several weeks. The great stink of London has transformed the world's most powerful city into what contemporary newspapers delicately describe as an open sewer under the dome of heaven, though you suspect the journalists responsible for that phrase have never actually worked in sewage management and probably wouldn't recognize proper drainage if it invited them to tea. You observe members of Parliament fleeing Westminster with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, their dignified retreat from the seat of empire, proving that even the most elevated political discourse cannot overcome the fundamental democracy of truly spectacular odors that affect rich and poor with ruthless equality. Dr. John Snow moves through this aromatic chaos with the methodical determination of someone who has discovered that solving medical mysteries requires considerably more patience than most people possess, and significantly more willingness to examine unpleasant evidence than polite society considers appropriate. You watch him map cholera cases with scientific precision, plotting each death on detailed street maps that reveal patterns invisible to casual observation, but devastatingly clear to anyone willing to look beyond surface appearances and traditional explanations that blame disease on mysterious atmospheric influences rather than contaminated water supplies. The investigation that connects cholera outbreaks to specific water sources demonstrates how scientific methodology can triumph over institutional prejudice when supported by sufficient evidence and stubborn persistence. You follow Dr. Snow as he traces infection patterns back to the Broad Street water pump, his detective work revealing how a single contaminated well can kill hundreds of people, while medical authorities continue to blame the deaths on miasmatic influences. A theory that sounds impressively scientific, but essentially amounts to blaming disease on bad air rather than admitting that London's water management resembles a medieval nightmare designed by particularly sadistic engineers. The social dynamics surrounding cholera investigation reveal Victorian society's complex relationship with scientific evidence and established authority. You observe how Dr. Snow's findings challenge not just medical theory, but also commercial interests and government policies that have invested heavily in explanations that avoid expensive infrastructure improvements. The resistance he encounters demonstrates how institutional inertia can override empirical evidence, when accepting new information would require admitting systematic failures and funding major reforms that nobody wants to pay for. Historians still debate whether the Great Stink directly caused government action on sewage reform, or simply provided convenient political cover for infrastructure investments that officials already knew were necessary, though the chronological evidence suggests that nothing motivates parliamentary attention, like legislators being forced to smell the consequences of their policy decisions during every working session. The speed with which funds became available for Joseph Bazalgette's sewage system suggests that personal discomfort can achieve policy changes that humanitarian concerns might struggle to accomplish through purely rational arguments. The engineering challenges involved in creating London's new sewage system require innovations that transform urban planning throughout the industrial world, though the technical details prove far less dramatic than the political negotiations required to coordinate construction across multiple jurisdictions and competing interests. You witness Bazalgette's team working with mathematical precision to calculate flow rates, pipe dimensions, and pumping station requirements that will move millions of gallons of waste material with the same reliability that the Postal Service delivers letters, though presumably with less pleasant working conditions for the employees involved. The public health implications of proper sewage management extend far beyond cholera prevention, creating improvements in general health outcomes that take decades to fully appreciate. The correlation between sewage infrastructure and mortality rates provides some of the earliest examples of systematic public health analysis, though the statistical methods remain primitive compared to modern epidemiological techniques. The data collection required to demonstrate these connections creates new forms of government bureaucracy dedicated to monitoring population health with scientific precision, rather than relying on traditional methods that essentially amounted to counting bodies and hoping for divine intervention. The international attention attracted by London's sewage crisis influences urban planning throughout Europe and North America, creating a global conversation about municipal responsibility for public health infrastructure. You observe delegations of foreign engineers studying Bazalgette's construction methods with the intense focus of art students examining masterpieces, though their notebooks probably contain significantly more practical information about pipelaying techniques and considerably fewer aesthetic observations about the sublime beauty of properly functioning waste management systems. The economic calculations that justify massive sewage investments demonstrate early applications of cost-benefit analysis to public health policy, creating analytical frameworks that continue to influence government decision-making about infrastructure spending. The financial arguments that convince taxpayers to fund sewage construction reveal how public health improvements can be marketed as economic investments rather than humanitarian obligations, establishing precedents for funding social services through appeals to fiscal responsibility rather than moral duty. The construction workforce required for sewage system installation creates employment opportunities that provide economic benefits beyond public health improvements, though the working conditions involve hazards that make most other industrial jobs seem relatively pleasant by comparison. You watch teams of laborers excavating tunnels beneath London streets with hand tools and primitive safety equipment, their dangerous work creating infrastructure that will serve the city for more than a century, while receiving recognition that falls somewhere between inadequate and completely invisible. The legal frameworks developed to regulate sewage construction establish precedents for government authority over private property and individual rights that continue to influence contemporary debates about environmental regulation and public health policy. The legislation that empowers municipal authorities to build sewage systems across private land demonstrates how public health emergencies can expand government power in ways that might otherwise face constitutional challenges, creating legal precedents that prove useful during future crises requiring rapid collective action. The technological innovations developed for sewage management include improvements in materials science, construction techniques, and hydraulic engineering that benefit other industries and infrastructure projects. The cast iron pipes, mechanical pumps, and construction methods created for London's sewage system influence everything from water supply networks to industrial facilities, demonstrating how investments in public health infrastructure can generate broader technological advances that justify their costs through applications that extend far beyond their original purposes. The social changes that result from effective sewage management include improvements in living conditions that make urban life more attractive for middle-class families and support population growth that fuels continued economic development. The elimination of cholera and other waterborne diseases removes major barriers to urban concentration, allowing cities to grow larger and more dense without facing periodic population collapses that had previously limited metropolitan development and economic specialization. The long-term impact of the Great Stink extends beyond sewage policy, influencing Victorian attitudes toward government responsibility, scientific expertise, and the relationship between individual rights and collective welfare. The crisis demonstrates how environmental problems can force political action when they affect powerful people directly, establishing patterns of crisis-driven reform that continue to characterize environmental policy throughout the modern period, though contemporary examples typically involve less aromatic but equally urgent challenges requiring similar combinations of scientific analysis and political will. As you walk along the Thames embankment in the gentle evening light, where Bazalgette's construction crews work by lamplight to install the infrastructure that will transform London from a public health disaster into a model of urban sanitation, you reflect on how this massive undertaking represents one of history's most successful examples of applied science solving social problems through systematic engineering and patient bureaucratic implementation. The soft sounds of construction work, hammering, digging, the splash of pumps moving water, create a rhythmic symphony of progress that makes it easy to imagine a future where cities function as smoothly as clockwork, their invisible infrastructure supporting millions of lives with the same reliable efficiency that delivers your morning newspaper, though hopefully with considerably less public attention to the specific details of how the system actually works. You find yourself sitting in the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon in 1842, watching Queen Victoria's carriage approach Constitution Hill with the stately elegance of a swan gliding across a peaceful lake. The air carries the soft murmur of crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of their sovereign, their voices creating a gentle hum that mingles with the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on well-maintained pavement. What you're about to witness isn't just another royal procession, but rather the transformation of public appearance from casual tradition into carefully choreographed security theater that will ultimately influence how governments protect their leaders for generations to come. Though the immediate participants probably imagine they're simply preventing one disturbed individual from interrupting an otherwise pleasant afternoon drive. The assassination attempt by Edward Oxford unfolds with the peculiar combination of high drama and bureaucratic response that characterizes most intersection points between individual desperation and institutional power. You observe the 18-year-old would-be assassin positioning himself among the crowd with the nervous energy of someone who has convinced himself that shooting at the Queen will somehow solve problems that he hasn't quite managed to articulate clearly, even to himself. His pistols, you note with the kind of historical irony that would amuse future scholars, are probably too poorly maintained to hit anything smaller than a barn door at close range, though nobody present possesses sufficient information to find this detail particularly reassuring. The immediate aftermath of Oxford's shots demonstrates how quickly routine events can transform into crisis management exercises that reveal the limitations of existing security procedures. You watch palace guards responding with the confused efficiency of people who have practiced emergency protocols, but never expected to use them, their training adequate for the immediate situation, but insufficient for the complex political implications that will emerge over the following weeks. The Queen's calm reaction, continuing her drive as if nothing unusual has occurred, reflects either remarkable composure or aristocratic training that treats assassination attempts as minor social inconveniences rather than genuine threats to personal safety. The investigation that follows Oxford's arrest reveals fascinating insights into Victorian attitudes toward political violence and mental illness, categories that often overlap in ways that make legal proceedings more complex than simple criminal prosecutions. You observe the careful examination of Oxford's background, motivations, and psychological state by officials who must balance public demands for justice against growing awareness that executing mentally unstable individuals might not serve society's long-term interests, though they lack modern psychiatric frameworks for making such distinctions with scientific precision. Historians still debate whether the multiple attempts on Queen Victoria's life reflected coordinated political opposition or simply statistical inevitability, given her frequent public appearances and the number of disturbed individuals in any large population, though the pattern suggests that royal visibility creates opportunities for attention-seeking behavior regardless of underlying political grievances. The fact that most attempts involved obviously defective weapons or impractical planning suggests that serious political assassins would probably choose different targets and methods than those employed by Victoria's various would-be killers. The security improvements implemented after each assassination attempt demonstrate the gradual evolution of royal protection from informal vigilance to systematic surveillance and threat assessment. You witness the careful expansion of police presence at royal events, the development of crowd control procedures, and the establishment of intelligence networks designed to identify potential threats before they materialize into actual attacks. These innovations transform royal appearances from spontaneous interactions between sovereign and subjects into carefully managed theatrical productions, where every participant plays a predetermined role in elaborate security ceremonies. The psychological impact of repeated assassination attempts on Queen Victoria herself reveals how public figures must develop coping mechanisms for living with constant awareness that any public appearance might attract violence from unpredictable sources. The correspondence between Victoria and her advisors shows her struggling to balance royal duty with personal safety, her determination to maintain public visibility conflicting with natural human instincts for self-preservation that become more pronounced with each new threat to her life and family. The legislative responses to assassination attempts include new laws that expand government authority to investigate and prosecute threats against royal family members, creating legal precedents that influence broader discussions about political violence and state security. The legislation passed after Oxford's attempt reflects parliamentary efforts to balance individual rights with collective security needs, though the practical implementation often depends more on administrative discretion than legal precision, creating enforcement patterns that vary significantly based on political circumstances and public opinion. The international dimensions of royal security concerns influence diplomatic relations and intelligence cooperation between European monarchies that face similar threats from political radicals and mentally unstable individuals. You observe the development of informal networks for sharing information about suspected assassins and coordinating security measures that protect royal families while they travel between countries, creating early examples of international law enforcement cooperation that anticipate modern approaches to transnational security threats. The social changes that result from improved royal security include alterations in the relationship between monarchy and public that make royal appearances less spontaneous, but more carefully designed to maximize positive political impact while minimizing security risks. The elaborate protocols that develop around royal events create new forms of ceremonial pageantry that satisfy public desire for access to their sovereign while maintaining protective barriers that previous generations would have considered incompatible with traditional concepts of royal accessibility and democratic accountability. The technological innovations developed for royal protection include improvements in crowd surveillance, communication systems, and transportation security that benefit broader law enforcement efforts beyond royal protection services. The methods created for monitoring crowds at royal events influence police techniques for managing large gatherings, while communication improvements developed for coordinating royal security enhance general law enforcement capabilities throughout the metropolitan area and beyond. The economic costs of enhanced royal security create budget pressures that require careful justification to parliamentary committees and public opinion that must balance security needs against other government spending priorities. The financial analysis of royal protection expenses reveals early applications of risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis to security planning, creating administrative frameworks that treat royal safety as one component of broader governmental responsibility for maintaining social stability and institutional continuity. The cultural impact of assassination attempts extends beyond immediate security concerns, influencing literary works, artistic representations, and popular entertainment that reflect public fascination with the relationship between individual violence and political authority. The novels, plays, and newspaper accounts that dramatize royal assassination attempts reveal Victorian society's complex attitudes toward monarchy, violence, and the psychological motivations that drive individuals to seek historical significance through attacks on prominent figures. The long-term consequences of improved royal security include the establishment of professional protection services that continue to evolve throughout the modern period, their techniques and organizational structures adapting to new technologies and emerging threats while maintaining core principles developed during Victoria's reign. The precedents established for balancing royal accessibility with personal safety continue to influence contemporary debates about democratic leadership and security requirements in societies that value both public accountability and individual protection. The intelligence networks that develop around royal protection create information-gathering capabilities that extend beyond immediate security concerns, establishing governmental surveillance capacities that raise questions about the relationship between protecting specific individuals and monitoring general population activities. The files maintained on potential threats to royal safety contain detailed information about citizens whose primary offense may be expressing unpopular political opinions rather than planning actual violence, creating databases that future governments might use for purposes that extend far beyond their original security justifications. As you watch the sun set over the peaceful London landscape, casting gentle shadows across the parks and gardens where future generations will walk safely, thanks to security innovations pioneered during Victoria's long reign, you reflect on how these early assassination attempts catalyzed changes that transformed the nature of public life for both leaders and citizens. The soft evening light illuminates a city, learning to balance democratic accessibility with security necessities, creating institutional frameworks that will endure long after the specific threats that inspired them have faded into historical curiosities. The gentle sounds of evening, birds settling into their roosts, distant church bells marking the hour, the soft conversations of people walking home from their daily work, create a peaceful soundtrack for a society slowly adapting to the modern reality that public leadership requires both courage and careful protection in a world where individual desperation can always threaten collective stability. You find yourself settling into a comfortable chair in a modestly appointed meeting room above a Whitechapel bakery on a foggy evening in November 1888, where the gentle warmth from the ovens below creates a cozy atmosphere that contrasts sharply with the grim purpose that has brought this unlikely assembly together. The air carries the comforting scent of fresh bread mixed with tobacco smoke from the gentlemen's pipes, creating an almost domestic tranquility that makes it easy to forget you're attending what might be history's most civilized response to serial murder. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee has transformed citizen outrage into parliamentary procedure, proving that even in the face of unprecedented horror, the British instinct for proper organization and detailed minute-taking will ultimately prevail over chaos and panic. The committee members arrive with the punctuality of people who have spent their entire lives attending meetings about parish matters, neighborhood improvements, and local business concerns, their familiarity with parliamentary procedure serving them well as they attempt to address problems that no previous committee has ever faced. You observe Mr. George Lusk, the committee chairman, calling the meeting to order with the same gentle authority he might use for discussing street lamp maintenance or organizing the annual church fete, though his agenda tonight involves considerably more discussion of homicidal maniacs and considerably fewer debates about refreshment arrangements. The transformation of community fear into organized civic response demonstrates the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to create institutional solutions for extraordinary problems when existing authorities prove inadequate to address urgent public concerns. You watch committee members reviewing their careful documentation of police patrol schedules, witness statements, and neighborhood security measures with the methodical attention that other volunteer organizations might devote to charity fundraising or social event planning, their systematic approach turning terror management into a form of elaborate community service that would be admirable if it weren't quite so necessary. The minutes from previous meetings reveal fascinating insights into how Victorian citizens attempted to balance individual rights with collective security when faced with crimes that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying civilized urban life. The discussions recorded in careful penmanship show committee members debating the propriety of organized citizen patrols, the effectiveness of reward offers, and the appropriate relationship between volunteer initiatives and official law enforcement, their conversations demonstrating political sophistication that would impress modern community organizers while addressing problems that most contemporary neighborhoods, fortunately, never encounter. Historians still debate whether the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee represented effective community self-defense or potentially dangerous vigilantism that might have interfered with official investigations, though the documentary evidence suggests that committee members remain scrupulously committed to supporting, rather than replacing, professional law enforcement. Their correspondence with police officials demonstrates diplomatic skills that would be useful in international negotiations, carefully offering assistance while avoiding any appearance of criticism or interference that might damage relationships with authorities whose cooperation they desperately needed. The practical activities undertaken by committee members include organizing neighborhood patrols that transform evening constitutionals into systematic surveillance operations designed to identify suspicious behavior and provide mutual protection for vulnerable residents. You observe the careful scheduling that ensures continuous coverage of dangerous areas without overwhelming volunteer resources, the patrol assignments creating social networks that strengthen community bonds while addressing immediate security concerns. The patrol logs maintained by volunteers read like military reconnaissance reports, though their authors are shopkeepers and clerks rather than professional soldiers. The reward fund established by the committee demonstrates early applications of crowdfunding principles to criminal investigation, creating financial incentives for information that might lead to arrest and conviction of the Ripper. The careful accounting that tracks contributions and expenditures reveals fundraising techniques that would be familiar to modern nonprofit organizations, complete with donor recognition procedures and transparent financial reporting that maintains public confidence in the committee's fiscal responsibility. The subscription lists show contributions from across British society, proving that the Ripper case attracted support that transcended class boundaries and geographic limitations. The correspondence between committee members and various authorities reveals the diplomatic challenges faced by citizen organizations attempting to influence official policy without appearing to usurp governmental authority or criticize professional competence. You examine letters to police commissioners, government ministers, and newspaper editors that demonstrate remarkable political sophistication in their careful balance of respectful deference and persistent advocacy, their authors understanding that effective citizen involvement requires maintaining cooperative relationships with official institutions rather than competing with established authority structures. The media attention attracted by committee activities includes newspaper coverage that transforms local volunteer work into national political commentary about government responsibility, police effectiveness, and citizen rights in democratic societies. The press releases prepared by committee members show understanding of public relations principles that would be familiar to modern political campaigns, though their goal involves encouraging law enforcement rather than winning elections. The committee's ability to maintain positive media coverage while avoiding sensationalism demonstrates communication skills that many contemporary organizations might envy. The social dynamics within the committee reflect broader Victorian attitudes toward class, gender, and civic responsibility, creating internal tensions that must be managed through careful diplomatic procedures and parliamentary courtesy. You observe the delicate negotiations required to balance different perspectives on appropriate responses to the crisis. Committee members bringing diverse backgrounds and conflicting priorities that must be reconciled through patient discussion and compromise rather than authoritarian decision-making. The meeting minutes record these negotiations with diplomatic discretion that conceals personality conflicts behind polite language and procedural formality. The intelligence-gathering activities undertaken by committee members include systematic collection and analysis of information about suspicious individuals, unusual behavior patterns, and potential leads that might assist official investigations. The files maintained by volunteers demonstrate organizational skills that would impress professional investigators, complete with cross-referenced indexes, timeline correlations, and analytical summaries that transform random observations into potentially useful intelligence resources. The committee's amateur detective work occasionally produces insights that professional investigators might overlook, though their methods remain carefully subordinated to official authority. The international attention attracted by the committee's work includes correspondence from similar organizations in other countries facing comparable challenges, creating informal networks for sharing information and techniques that transcend national boundaries. The letters exchanged between citizen groups demonstrate how local responses to crime can influence global conversations about community self-defense, police reform, and the appropriate relationship between governmental authority and citizen initiative in democratic societies. The decline of committee activities after the Ripper murders cease reflects the temporary nature of crisis-driven volunteer organizations, though the institutional precedents established during their operation continue to influence community organizing and citizen involvement in public safety issues. The careful dissolution procedures that wind down committee operations demonstrate the same organizational competence that characterize their emergency response, complete with final financial reports and equipment distribution that ensure accountability and preserve institutional memory for potential future activation. The legacy of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee extends beyond immediate responses to serial murder, influencing broader discussions about citizen participation in law enforcement and community responsibility for public safety that continue to shape contemporary debates about neighborhood watch programs, community policing, and volunteer involvement in security issues. The precedents established for organizing citizen responses to criminal threats provide models that other communities adapt to address different but equally challenging public safety concerns. The documentation maintained by committee members creates historical records that provide unique insights into Victorian working-class attitudes toward crime, authority, and community responsibility, revealing perspectives that official sources often overlook or misrepresent. The meeting minutes, correspondence files, and personal diaries kept by committee participants offer researchers access to authentic voices from one of history's most famous criminal cases, their accounts providing human-scale perspectives on events that newspaper coverage and police reports tend to present in more abstract institutional terms. As the evening meeting concludes with the same procedural courtesy that opened it, committee members gathering their papers and extinguishing their pipes before venturing back into the fog-shrouded streets that have consumed so much of their attention over the past several months. You reflect on how their patient organizational work represents one of history's most remarkable examples of ordinary citizens creating extraordinary responses to unprecedented challenges through the simple application of meetings, minutes, and mutual cooperation. The gentle sounds of chairs being arranged and papers being filed create a peaceful conclusion to another evening's work in the ongoing project of transforming fear into action through the patient application of democratic procedures and community solidarity. You find yourself standing in the soft gaslight of a courthouse corridor as the 19th century draws to its gentle close, where the marble floors gleam with the polished perfection of institutions that have learned to transform human drama into bureaucratic procedure with remarkable efficiency. The year is 1899, and the air carries that distinctive blend of leather-bound law books, floor wax, and something indefinably final that seems to emanate from endings of all kinds, not just individual cases, but entire eras of human justice that are quietly disappearing into history, like morning mist dissolving in warm sunlight. You're witnessing the subtle transformation of criminal justice from public spectacle to private administration, a change so gradual that most participants barely notice they're participating in one of civilization's most profound shifts toward institutional compassion. The evolution of punishment during this remarkable century reflects broader changes in society's understanding of human nature, moral responsibility, and the purpose of justice itself. You observe the last public executions giving way to private procedures conducted within prison walls, where the state's ultimate authority over life and death continues, but without the carnival atmosphere that once made criminal punishment a form of popular entertainment. The crowds that formerly gathered to witness hangings now attend theatrical performances and sporting events, their hunger for dramatic spectacle satisfied by entertainments that don't require actual human suffering as the price of admission. The prison reforms implemented throughout the century demonstrate remarkable progress in understanding how institutional environments can either promote rehabilitation or guarantee recidivism, though the practical application of these insights often depends more on administrative competence than theoretical sophistication. You watch prison officials designing daily routines that emphasize education, work training, and moral instruction rather than simple physical punishment, their efforts creating environments that treat convicted criminals as human beings capable of improvement rather than irredeemable monsters, worthy only of suffering and social exclusion. The statistical analysis that begins to inform criminal justice policy represents early applications of social science methodology to legal administration, creating evidence-based approaches that challenge traditional assumptions about crime causation and punishment effectiveness. The careful documentation of recidivism rates, rehabilitation outcomes, and sentencing patterns provides decision-makers with empirical data that supports more effective and humane approaches to criminal justice, though the interpretation of these statistics often reflects political considerations as much as scientific analysis. Historians still debate whether 19th century criminal justice reforms represented genuine humanitarian progress, or simply more sophisticated methods of social control that maintained class hierarchies while appearing more civilized, though the lived experiences of prisoners and their families suggest that improvements in treatment conditions mattered regardless of underlying political motivations. The transformation from physical punishment to psychological rehabilitation created new forms of institutional power that proved more subtle but potentially more effective than traditional approaches based primarily on fear and physical deterrence. The professionalization of law enforcement during this period establishes career structures and training programs that transform policing from casual employment into systematic public service, requiring specialized knowledge and ethical standards. You observe the development of police academies, promotion procedures, and disciplinary protocols that create institutional cultures dedicated to public service rather than personal authority, though the implementation of these ideals remains inconsistent across different jurisdictions and social contexts. The legal procedures that evolve throughout the century reflect growing recognition that fair trials require more than simply allowing defendants to speak in their own defense before predetermined outcomes are announced by authorities who have already decided their fate. The expansion of defense rights, evidence rules, and appellate procedures create systems that prioritize accuracy over efficiency, establishing precedents for due process that continue to influence contemporary legal practice, even when political pressures encourage shortcuts and simplified procedures. The social welfare programs that begin to address crime prevention through poverty reduction represent early recognition that criminal behavior often reflects social conditions rather than individual moral failure, creating policy approaches that attempt to eliminate crime causes rather than simply punishing criminal effects. The charitable organizations, educational initiatives, and employment programs developed during this period demonstrate understanding that preventing crime requires addressing underlying social problems that create conditions where criminal behavior becomes attractive or necessary for survival. The international exchange of criminal justice innovations reflects growing awareness that crime problems transcend national boundaries and benefit from cooperative approaches that share successful techniques while avoiding repeated failures. The conferences, publications, and official visits that spread reform ideas across different countries create networks of professional knowledge that accelerate improvements in criminal justice systems worldwide, though cultural differences often require significant adaptation of techniques that prove successful in their original contexts. The technological improvements in criminal investigation during this period include advances in photography, fingerprinting, and document analysis that provide law enforcement with scientific tools for establishing guilt or innocence based on physical evidence rather than witness testimony or confessions that might be unreliable. The forensic laboratories that begin to support criminal investigations represent early applications of scientific methodology to legal questions, creating analytical capabilities that transform criminal trials from debates about credibility into examinations of empirical evidence. The victims' rights movements that emerge during this period reflect growing recognition that criminal justice systems must serve those harmed by crime, as well as society's broader interests in maintaining order and deterring future offenses. The support services, compensation programs, and procedural protections developed for crime victims create institutional mechanisms for addressing harm that extends beyond simple punishment of offenders, establishing precedents for restorative justice approaches that continue to evolve throughout the modern period. The juvenile justice innovations pioneered during the 19th century represent fundamental shifts in understanding childhood, moral development, and the appropriate relationship between punishment and education for young offenders. The separate court systems, specialized facilities, and treatment programs created for juvenile defendants reflect recognition that children require different approaches than adult criminals, establishing institutional frameworks that prioritize rehabilitation over retribution while maintaining accountability for harmful behavior. The community corrections programs that begin during this period demonstrate growing understanding that many offenders can be supervised safely within their communities rather than requiring expensive and potentially counterproductive incarceration that separates them from families, employment opportunities, and social support systems that might facilitate successful reintegration into law-abiding society. The probation systems, work release programs, and community service options that develop during this era create alternatives to imprisonment that serve justice goals while minimizing social disruption. As you walk slowly through the quiet courthouse corridors where the day's business has concluded, and the evening cleaning staff work with the gentle efficiency of people who understand that justice requires both grand pronouncements and careful maintenance of the mundane details that make institutional fairness possible. You reflect on how this century's gradual transformation of criminal justice represents one of humanity's most significant achievements in civilizing the relationship between individual wrongdoing and collective response. The soft sounds of distant conversations, closing doors, and footsteps on marble floors create a peaceful symphony that seems to whisper of all the quiet progress that occurs when societies choose compassion over vengeance, understanding over condemnation, and patient reform over dramatic gestures that satisfy immediate emotional needs, while failing to address underlying problems that perpetuate cycles of crime and punishment. The gentle gaslight flickers against the courthouse walls, casting warm shadows that seem to embrace both the day's concluded dramas and the promise of tomorrow's continued work toward justice that serves both individual dignity and collective security. As you settle into the peaceful rhythm of evening settling over this temple of human judgment, you can almost hear the soft breathing of a civilization learning to sleep more peacefully, knowing that its systems of justice have grown more wise, more fair, and more humane with each passing year of patient institutional evolution that transforms human nature's darker impulses into opportunities for redemption, understanding, and hope for better futures built on the accumulated wisdom of countless small improvements in how we treat each other when we fall short of our highest aspirations. The clock tower chimes the hour with gentle resonance that seems to mark not just the passage of time, but the completion of a century's patient work toward justice that honors both human frailty and human potential for growth, change, and eventual redemption through systems that have learned to balance accountability with compassion, punishment with mercy, and the demands of social order with recognition of individual dignity that endures even in the darkest moments of moral failure and criminal choice. Sleep well, knowing that even in our imperfect world, there are always people working quietly, patiently, hopefully toward systems of justice that serve our better angels, while acknowledging our persistent human capacity for both great harm and great healing, both criminal behavior and redemptive transformation, both individual failing and collective progress toward societies that protect the innocent, while offering genuine opportunities for those who have lost their way to find paths back to community, contribution, and peaceful membership in the ongoing human project of creating civilizations worthy of our highest dreams and deepest hopes for what we might become together.